My name is Wynne Moss, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. As some of you might know, our research group at CU Boulder, including my advisor, Peter Johnson, and fellow graduate student Travis McDevitt-Gallus, have been surveying ponds throughout the Bay Area over the past 10 years, with a primary focus on the impact of disease and species invasions on amphibian populations. Today, I'm going to talk about some of our recent work that evaluates long-term trends of amphibian populations with an emphasis on the impact of drought. Amphibians are often a target of monitoring programs, and within the Bay Area, there are several land management agencies, in addition to our own group's work, that have been monitoring amphibians over the past decade. Although these different groups have collected thousands of surveys, the data hadn't really been compiled or analyzed as a whole until this project. So for this project, we partnered with several agencies. Those were East Bay Regional Park District, East Bay Municipal Utility District, and Santa Clara County Parks. And we received a grant from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to pool and analyze all of our monitoring data. We focused on data collected over the past decade, and we focused on surveys that occurred all throughout the Bay Area, which consisted of pond locations in Alameda, Santa Clara, and Contra Costa counties. And within this study area, there were over 400 ponds that had surveys for amphibians, and that spanned 10 different agencies. And this makes up a really large potential data set to start to understand large scale and long-term trends. More specifically, we had 3 objectives for this project. The first was to quantify trends for 7 different species within the Bay Area to see if there's been any changes on long-term timescales. We also wanted to understand how several factors influence amphibian population stability. These are factors that we know from previous studies are important for amphibian viability, including variation in weather and climate, invasive species like fish and bullfrogs, pond habitat quality, and the land use surrounding each pond. So a major aim of this project was to test whether these factors could explain any of the trends that we see. Finally, we wanted to use the output of these analyses to define restoration targets. Those are either sites that could benefit from restoration work or specific actions to target some of these stressors. And what I'm going to focus on today is 3 species of interest within the East Bay Regional Park District and within the larger Bay Area. The final data set we used for this analysis included 473 ponds, 194 of which were located within East Bay Regional Park District lands. And these ponds were spread out across a number of different properties shown on the right. And typically what these sites look like are small ponds located primarily within grassland landscapes. We included survey data between 2009 and 2019, and many of those sites were surveyed more than once in that time period, so we had a total of more than 2,500 surveys. And those surveys included any visit to a pond between May and August, which used at least one of these 3 survey methods. We obtained data on 7 different amphibian species, and these represent the 7 native species the 7 amphibian species that use these ponds to breed. 6 of these are native species, and 1, the American bullfrog, is an invasive species. In our analysis, we only considered data on juvenile stages of these species. That's because the adult forms don't always use ponds, they can be difficult to detect, and they're long-lived, meaning that their relationship with the stressors that we're interested in may be less sensitive. So one thing to keep in mind when I show the maps and trends of these species is that I'm focusing primarily on changes in breeding activity. We've analyzed data on all 7 of these species, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to focus on just these 3 species. The California tiger salamander and California red-legged frog are of interest because of their status as protected species, and they've also been the target of a lot of restoration efforts. So we're really interested in understanding whether they show evidence of recovery. The American bullfrog I mentioned is an exotic and invasive species, and so it has the potential for negative impacts on these other species, and we want to make sure that that species is not spreading throughout the Bay Area. The basic approach we used to analyze these data was occupancy modeling, and this is a tool that allows us to account for the fact that survey effort and survey methodology varies over time, and that sometimes our surveys may actually fail to detect a species even when it is present. I'm not going to dive into the math too much, but I'm going to define a few important terms. The first is occupancy probability, which is the probability that a pond contains a species in a given year. So if a species occurs at a pond, the probability of occupancy is 1, and if it doesn't occur, the probability is 0. So in terms of trends, we're really interested in how this probability varies across time. We can additionally estimate 2 other processes. The first is persistence, and that's the probability that a pond that's occupied in 1 year is still occupied the next year. And we can test how some of these stressors, things like overwintering habitat, pond size, hydro period, how those actually correlate with the probability of persistence. Colonization is the probability that a pond goes from unoccupied in 1 year to occupied the next year. And that could be impacted by things like invasive species, the availability of dispersal habitat, and seasonal precipitation events. So you can see how linking these processes of persistence and colonizations to various stressors could provide more mechanistic insight on how you might approach, say, maintaining current populations versus trying to increase an amphibian's distribution on larger landscape scales. The final probability we estimate is detection probability, which is the probability that if a species is truly there, that you will detect it. And that can depend on things like the date of a survey and the method used. And this part of the model is really important for thinking about how to design and maximize surveys. As I mentioned, we're interested in understanding trends in amphibians over the past decade. And right in the middle of that decade, California had one of the worst droughts in 1,000 years, which occurred between 2011 and 2015. And what that meant for amphibians is that when they went to breed at a site in early May, many of the ponds looked like this. And to put a number on just how bad that drought was, we estimated the proportion of ponds that failed to hold water throughout August. And that is shown with the line in red in the upper right. And you can see in a normal year, the proportion of sites that go dry is less than 10%, whereas in 2014, which is the worst year of the drought, about half of the ponds failed to hold water until August. Similarly, we see years with below average precipitation, especially in spring, which is an important cue for amphibian egg laying. So that doesn't seem like a great sign for amphibian stability. But at the same time, fish, which are a major predator of amphibians, were lost from many of the sites that went dry for the first time during drought. And in East Bay Regional Park District, about a quarter of the sites that contained fish lost them during the drought. So what we were really interested in understanding is what the net effect on amphibian species was. I'll start with bullfrogs, and I'll show you the trend from the entire Bay Area as a whole. So remember, this is Alameda, Contra Costa, and Santa Clara counties. And you can see that starting in 2012, bullfrogs started to decline. And they declined throughout the drought, which is that box shown in gray. And their occupancy remained low in the years following drought. So as of 2019, the average probability that a pond would contain a bullfrog was less than 20%. It's closer to something like 12%. The other thing we saw with bullfrogs is that they had very low colonization rates. So the probability of a given pond getting colonized by bullfrogs was less than 1%. On the other hand, they also had really high persistence, meaning that a pond that had bullfrogs in 1 year had a 95% chance of retaining them in a normal year. But those rates are impacted by a few factors. In general, later rains tend to benefit bullfrogs, so they preferred years where the majority of precipitation fell in spring rather than winter, and they seemed very less likely to colonize sites where there's a high proportion of grassland cover around that pond. And of course, they strongly preferred permanent relative to temporary ponds. And you can see that signature of drought where they had much lower persistence rates when there were high drought conditions, especially when drought severity was high during fall. Within East Bay Regional Park District, bullfrog presence was relatively uncommon, with less than 10% of the sites we surveyed containing bullfrogs. And of those sites, they were fairly unaffected by drought, meaning that a lot of those declines you saw in the previous graph occurred in properties that were not managed by East Bay Regional Parks. When we look at parks within East Bay Regional Park District, which the sites that we have great data on are Briones, Guerin, and Pleasanton, we can see that the mean occupancy, which is that solid line, remains relatively low throughout the entire study period. We can also look at histories of individual ponds. So each row on this plot is a pond, and the color of a given box is the probability of bullfrog occupancy in that year. So one thing that's really interesting about this is that sites without bullfrogs tend to not gain them, and sites with bullfrogs tend to retain them through every year of the study. So this reinforces the fact that bullfrogs have high persistence and low colonization, and generally they're not very widely distributed throughout the park district. California tiger salamanders showed a strong decline during drought years in the Bay Area as a whole, but they appeared to recover, and by 2019 they had reached similar levels as to the beginning of the study. California tiger salamanders had among the lowest rates of persistence at only 34%. And that means a pond that's occupied in one year has only about a 1/3 chance of being occupied the next year. That might seem surprising, but it does match what other studies say about this species, which is that they have really high interannual variability. In terms of monitoring tiger salamanders, because they have such high turnover, it can be really hard to detect trends over time. One thing that will help is more data and better detection. And our models tell us that conducting surveys earlier in the season and using seines as a survey tool will improve detection. Biologically, these species preferred temporary ponds surrounded by a lot of grassland cover. And they did not occur with fish at all in our study system. And they did not do particularly well in ponds that were surrounded by a lot of developed land. When we zoom in on East Bay Regional Park District, we can see that out of 194 sites, 74 of them contained tiger salamanders at least once. But many of these sites did not have repeated surveys, which means it's really hard to examine trends in this species over time. So the take-home point for me is that while there appears to be really widespread potential habitat, we don't have enough surveys in these properties to understand whether tiger salamanders are increasing or decreasing within that habitat. But the trends from the Bay Area in general suggest that they're pretty stable, and looking at those trends is something we're focusing on with the ecological health assessment right now. Red-legged frogs have probably the happiest trend of any amphibian within the Bay Area, and they actually show strong increases over time. This is probably tied to the loss of fish and bullfrogs in relation to drought, and dedicated restoration efforts to modify hydroperiod for this species. Many of the sites that were colonized are those that lost fish or were modified, and there have been really big gains in East Bay Municipal Utility District lands in particular. Unlike tiger salamanders, red-legged frogs prefer ponds with long hydroperiods, but this preference depends on conditions. So in wetter years, they did tend to use temporary ponds. Drought conditions do impact red-legged frogs, but you can see from that trend line that the effect isn't huge. In between 2012 and 2015, they didn't appear to recover, but they also didn't have as large of declines as other species. Finally, they're less likely to colonize ponds where there's a lot of habitat development and where fish occur. While the overall trend in the Bay Area is increasing, within East Bay Regional Parks District, red-legged frogs seem more stable. And you can see that occupancy bounces around a little bit over time in these 4 parks. On average, about half of the sites in each of these parks has been occupied at least once, which is quite high. And over the entire data set, almost 40% of sites have been occupied at least once. And that suggests that there's a lot of great habitat for this species throughout the district. When we look at individual site histories, we can see that sites blink on and off for red-legged frogs much more frequently than they did for bullfrogs. But the higher colonization rates mean that we did have some sites in East Bay Regional Park District that appeared to gain red-legged frogs over the past decade. And I've highlighted 4 sites where we believe that they colonized during the past decade, and those occur throughout 4 different properties. I'll just quickly show the trends in the Bay Area for all 7 of these amphibian species, just for context. And note that the y-axis is different for these species because some of them are just more widely distributed. The 2 species I didn't talk about that are particularly interesting are the Pacific chorus frog in blue and the California newt in orange. These species are the most common species, and they also are those that showed the greatest impact of drought. And you can just see how large that decrease was, especially during 2014. But the other kind of amazing thing about these species is that they recovered within 2 years. To wrap up, what we've seen from this analysis is that amphibian breeding, both within the East Bay Regional Park District and Bay Area as a whole, is relatively stable, and that's despite one of the worst droughts in the past 1,000 years. One species that would benefit from more targeted monitoring within East Bay Regional Park District is California tiger salamander, where we have relatively few repeated observations over time. More generally, occupancy models can help inform survey design by telling us how to improve detection of the species that we're really interested in surveying. In terms of management, it seems as though having a diversity of hydroperiods within properties could be important in maintaining overall amphibian biodiversity. And the reason is twofold. One is that permanent sites, while they aren't preferred by all species in an average year, can be really valuable refugia during droughts. And we saw for a number of species that their preference on permanent versus temporary ponds changed depending on drought conditions. Second, species differ in their preference. So for instance, creating more permanent water bodies across the board might benefit a species like the red-legged frog, but it could negatively impact tiger salamanders. For invasive species, our results showed that fish were more detrimental to native amphibians than were bullfrogs. They had negative impacts on both of the protected species we studied. Bullfrogs didn't have a huge impact, at least on occurrence, but we're currently working on a study that relates bullfrogs to amphibian densities. Finally, drought may represent a potential management opportunity. It seems like native species are able to rebound relatively quickly once the drought ends, but years with high drought could also be times where managers could capitalize on invasive species removal because we know that ponds are small and maybe easy to drain during those years. And we know that these invasive species seem like they're hit harder and take longer to recover from drought. I'd like to thank the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for funding this study through their state wildlife grant program. Data were collected by dozens of field technicians over the past decades, as well as biologists from these different agencies. And our field technicians were amazing despite even some of the most challenging sampling conditions. I'd also like to thank all of the biologists and land stewards from East Bay Municipal Utility District, East Bay Regional Park District, and Santa Clara County Parks, who contributed their past data and gave really valuable feedback on this project. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Great, thank you all for listening. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I'll start with some questions from the Q&A. One question was, regarding the higher occupancy rates on East Bay Municipal Utility District land, do you have guesses to the cause, geographic land use, or management differences? I want to clarify that there's not necessarily higher occupancy rates on East Bay mudland, but there were higher recovery rates. So the changes in occupancy were higher on East Bay mud than they were in East Bay regional parks. And I think a lot of that is due to really active restoration efforts that are happening in East Bay mud. There's definitely a lot of restoration efforts happening in East Bay Regional Park District, but some of those sites weren't necessarily included in our analysis. We had another question. Can you clarify which fish species were lost during drought? Were you evaluating loss of mosquito fish as well as predatory fish? This is a great question. For our analyses, we pooled together all of the fish species, and that's because we had, out of the 400 or so ponds that we looked at, the vast majority of them didn't have fish. So we had a relatively small sample size of ponds with fish. And that meant that we couldn't have the statistical power to evaluate each fish species separately. So some of those sites do have mosquito fish, and some of them do have predatory game fish. And we're currently working on a study that looks at amphibian abundance, not just occupancy. And so that study might allow us to look more closely at how the different species of fish are impacting amphibian species. Matt or Sunshine, do I have time for other questions?
Yeah, you can do a couple more.
Okay. Let's see. You mentioned that bullfrogs do not have as detrimental effects on occupancy across all amphibians. Did you evaluate effects on each species differently? Yes, so we ran a different model for each native amphibian species. So we can look at how these different stressors differ across species. And as a whole, bullfrogs tended to have fewer impacts on native species. Almost every native species was negatively impacted by fish, whereas only a couple of them were negatively impacted by bullfrogs. And as far as we know, the impacts of bullfrogs tend to manifest really strongly when you look at native amphibian abundances. So they tend to reduce the abundance of native amphibians at a site, but they don't have as strong effects on occupancy. So basically what that means is native amphibians will often still breed at a site with bullfrogs, but they'll achieve lower densities. And the one downside of using occupancy models is we don't always pick up on those kinds of subtle differences. Let's see.
Well, thanks, Wynne. So I see that one of the next comments, Wynne, it's Matt. One of the next questions is one of our staff asking about involving more staff in reports of CTS occupancy. And it says many of them have some knowledge of protected species and habitats. And, I think we've done that occasionally. We knew someone was very interested and we were going out to do a survey, but I really appreciate the question. I don't know who's asking it because you're logged in as an anonymous attendee. So shoot me an email and Sunshine an email, whoever this is from the Park District, and we'd be happy to talk to you. And I think that's something we're looking to do more of is when we come out and do work involving staff. And if you have knowledge about or want to know more or want to tell us something about a pond, that's the dialogue we want to be having. And so we need to create more opportunities for sharing that information. So thanks for the question, and let's talk more. And so there's one more on bullfrog occupancy, and then we'll go to the next talk. So.
Last question was, why was bullfrog occupancy in district ponds so low? Has the district been actively removing them? I will confess that I don't know a whole lot about what sort of efforts were made prior to 2009, which is when I started, the data that I analyzed came from. So it's totally possible that prior to 2009, there was a lot of restoration. I think probably someone at the district could answer that a little bit more. As far as the sites that we studied, to our knowledge, very few of them were drained during the course of our study. So it may just be kind of a historic effect that we're seeing. Thanks for all your questions. I'm going to throw my contact info into the Q&A. And so if you have any more questions, feel free to email me. Thanks.